Hello everyone, Thursday gang. Back to the Thursday gang rather than the Monday gang, which was confusing people. So, hi all of you from wherever you are. Most of you are sat in rain, like I am at the moment. But there we go. Let's have it. There were a couple of questions that were in the commenty stuff, so let's just have a little look. One of them was Bruce's from Monday's session. So, what kind of helicopter were you in? So it was that one was a Eurocopter, so an EC-120. And were the doors on or off? So it depends on the helicopter. So that yes, the doors were they were open in that case. So if you're in something small like a R44 or something like that, or even R22 if you want to go really small, you literally take the doors off and fly. On something like a Eurocopter, you can fly completely with the doors open, which is what we did, or you can fly faster with the doors closed, get to where you want to shoot, and then just clip, and then slide the door open rather than removing it. Because removing it in flight is a bit of a challenge in where to put it. So there we go. That's Bruce's question. And then the other one, where were we? Before we get going, it's from Dick about flattening the layers. We'll cover it in a second, but the answer is no, you can't. So it doesn't actually save you any file size really. And we'll talk about that in a second. So let's get into today's session. So as normal, for those of you that have been on for a few times, you know that we are using the current latest release version. So no betas, no weird versions or anything like that. This is the latest production version, which is 13.1.3. Please, if you're on the latest version, so Capture 120/13, depending on whether you look at software or marketing material, make sure you've done the point updates, the point 1.3. It fixes some bugs. It also adds extra camera and lens support and all that other stuff. So please make sure you're on the latest one. If you don't have Capture One at all, go to capture1.com, download it for free, use it for free for 30 days. There's no restrictions on it. It's not like these trials where, I don't know, there's a watermark and stuff like that. It's just a free version of it that you can use. And if you don't have it at all, that's a good way of going forward. If you do have it on an older version, bear in mind, and you'll have heard all the rumours already out there, and we talked about it on Monday, there is a new version coming out. So have a look at offers that are going to come up, hopefully, on all the upgrades. But for today, we're on 13.1.3, which is today's, or as of now, current version. So let's get into Capture One. Let's go back onto the layers question. So Dick, you were disappointed in the answer, but I'd question as to why you need to flatten the layers, because the actual Capture One file is effectively, there is no such thing as a Capture One file in that sense. You've got the raw data, and then you've got the layers or the adjustments that are effectively made to that raw data, and that's stored in either the catalog or the session file, depending on which way you choose to organize. So if you wanted the flat file out, then you'd export it as, I don't know, TIFF, JPEG, whatever takes your fancy. That's going to be a flattened version. So that's the version of your file, which is the combination of your raw file and the edit. But that version, if I save that out as a 16-bit TIFF, if my raw is, let's say, 20 meg, my 16-bit TIFF is probably going to be around about 180 to 200 meg, something like that. So that's the flattened version, and you can't then go back into the edits. The Capture One file is tiny. It's a couple of meg at most, because all it's storing is the adjustments and the file itself. If, however, you want to export as effectively one file to give to someone in Capture One, instead of exporting as a TIFF in this sense, what you do is you go to your export menu and you choose Originals. And under Originals, you can choose to export with whatever names and so on as an EIP. And the EIP file is basically the transportable version. It's like a suitcase which has got the raw file and the adjustments built into the one EIP file. And then you can give that to anyone else with Capture One and they can open it up. So EIP is effectively your portable version of Capture One's adjustments on top of the raw file, and it's going to be a lot smaller than an exported TIFF, which is a flat version of the file. So hopefully that sort of helps a little bit. But if there was another reason, just let me know during the session, Dick, and we'll have a look at it. Okay, so we're going to start today with Brian's shot of a mountain, and I'm not sure whether this was the one that he brought up in the Facebook group another way, or whether it's a different one. However, we've got two versions of the same mountain, so this one and this one. I'm personally drawn to this one, even though I'm going to crop it. And the reason is, this one, I feel like we need some more space around it. So it's a really nice shot of the mountains. It's sunrise / sunset, I'm not sure which one. But I want to give it a bit of breathing room off to the side, pretty much down here. So what we're going to do is we're going to start from this version here. Check that our lens profile is loaded in, which it has. At 5.6, we're not going to load in diffraction correction. It's probably not going to do any harm, but we don't need to. You can see Capture One in the lens profile has already put on 100% distortion. So it knows that on that RF lens, on the camera, which I'm presuming is a EOS R or an R5 or RP, okay. On that lens, with that camera, Capture One's decided that you need some distortion correction. If I turn this off, you'll see that it pinches back in. So effectively, it's a punch correction to bring the frame correct and make sure all the lines are straight. Bit difficult to see in a mountain, I get that. So if I go to my crop tool, I'm going to choose, so at the top you've got crop, and we can choose one of the presets. You can add your own aspect ratio if you want, or if you want to stick with what you've already got, you can go to original. You can use unconstrained and use the keyboard modifiers, things like the shift key and so on, to override the handles, but if you want to stick to the original crop factor, just leave it as original, and then it means that as I pull these handles in, it's going to keep them in the right way. So I'm going to crop this in to about here. I'm going to lift this up just a touch. This moon, ironically, is a little bit annoying because I wish that was a bit more in the frame. So we've got a decision to make effectively. So in terms of artistically, do we like the moon right on the edge of the frame in the print? No, we don't. Was the moon there? Yes, it was. So it's a bit of a tough call to remove the moon, but it's actually a bit distracting in this shot. If only it was a little bit further in. Now, I don't really want to get into the position where we're moving the moon. Certainly, well, yeah, whole new or whole can of worms if we start playing around with the moon and the stars and stuff like that. But in this framing here, and we'll come back to the moon in a second, it just feels a bit more open than this tight frame here. Now, there are a couple of things that we might want to look at in this shot. So number one, we don't have anything that's massively overexposed. If I turn my exposure warning on up here, nothing in there. And we can check the exposure warning is working by ramping it up, and we can see around these lines we've got it there. So we don't have any exposure or overexposure in the shot. We don't have to worry about my highlights, which is great. But to me, and I think we talked about this a little bit in the Facebook group, Brian, on another shot. I'm sure it was your shot. Anyway, this is looking a little bit green. The snow down here, and it's just where it's sat in the shade. So to me, I'd sort of be tempted to try and fix this. So in my head, let's choose our white balance picker and let's just try and choose the snow. Okay. It's not done a bad job. Now we've lost some of the blue tones, which is a problem, but it's still kept it relatively green. And look at that shift on white balance. It's gone from 5,000 and something, I think. It's just, I don't know, 6,337, right the way up to, let's just go again. Let's pick a bit down here, 10,520. So it's a massive shift towards warm, which is a little bit of a problem. So we need to go somewhere in between. We've talked about this before. The white balance picker is great on a standard day with standard daylight. No golden hour, no shade, no nothing like that, because all of those things change what looks or what appears white in your shot. So we can't really use this picker when it comes to things like sunsets. It just doesn't work. So instead we've got to do it by eye. And actually my preference is always to do it by eye anyway. And remember these two scales. We've got Kelvin, which goes from cold, so blue, up to warm, so orangey yellow. And then you've got tint, which was originally to factor in or to counterbalance color cast that comes in filters. So tint goes from green to pink. And it's basically because pieces of glass that you put in front of your camera are either going to have a pink tint or a green tint, and you can use the tint slider to counter it. But we can also use the tint slider to remove any green hint, effectively, in shadows where we've got a white balance shift like this. So let's have a look at overall up here. I'm pretty happy with the sky. I might want to go a little bit cooler. And it's this tint I'm just going to change there. And if we go to before and after just with that change, you'll see now what I mean by this just felt green. It feels a bit too green tint and a bit too cold. Whereas on here, with this switch, actually this is now maybe a little bit too pink even, so we can probably calm this down a little bit there to keep it neutral. And one of the ways that we can see that it's neutral, actually it's still a little bit blue, but as I move my mouse over the screen, this readout up here is giving me red, green, blue, and luminosity readouts. So as I move my mouse over the white snow, we can see it's a little bit blue, which actually explains why the auto white balance would have pulled that all the way up. Let's get back to that 10,000. Now when I move it over here, we can see it's evened up a little bit, 92, 88, 94. It's a little bit more even than it was when we pulled it back down to how it was shot. Here, look at that skew to 112 blue versus 88 green, red at 83. So that's what the white balance tool is actually doing. It's effectively getting all of those numbers to be equal to make them white. And that's why you get that massive swing. So what we're going to do is we're going to just warm it up a bit. We're not going to fix all of that blue tint completely, but we get it there so it's looking a bit more neutral. So let's just have a look there from there to there. I'm happier with this, but now we've got the other tweaks that we can make. One question, JD, I'm going to pull it up just because you said later in the session, but I'll forget that you asked the question. Capture One released a version 10 keyboard. Does it still work with version 20? So it does, but you're going to be missing some of the buttons. So what happened in version 20 is some of the keyboard shortcuts changed. I think you're talking about the Logic keyboard. I used one for quite a while, actually. They were actually really good. But in version 20, you had things like the Y key and the Q key that were introduced for some of the new tools, and they haven't been updated on that Logic keyboard. So unfortunately, it's a little bit out of date now, unless you want to remove those keyboard shortcuts. So yes, it will still work with version 20, but you're not going to have certain of the functions clearly labeled, let's say, on the keyboard. This will obviously work if you press the Y key. Okay. So, and then, where were we? Alan's just asked, why not correct the white balance on the mountain with a layer? Simply because this one is a global white balance change, and I'm going to do it to the whole background. I can do it on a filled layer if I want to, so I can create a brand new adjustment layer that's filled here, and I could do the white balance change. That's personal choice. In my head, logically, I tend to do the overall global stuff on the background layer because I know that that's going to be the same for the whole image from that point onwards. When we get into local adjustments, then all of those ones I'll build up as a layer over the top. Okay, and June's just asked, what's the fourth number? So, well, yeah, fun one. So you've got red, green, and blue, and that's out of a scale of 0 down to 255. So 255 being the most red, the most green, the most blue, and 0 being none of it. So it's effectively the value of RGB. The grey number is the luminosity. So effectively a form of average of those numbers. It's not quite the midpoint. If you look at the numbers, they don't quite work out as the midpoint. But it's the same thing as if I switch down here in curves. You see this curve here, you've got this there's a slight variance. I just want to pick on another picture. So we're going to go to this picture just to see the difference. No, not enough. Giving you a preview of what we're going to go through. There we go. So this one, we've got quite a lot of difference, see, between the red and the green and the blue channel. So if I move my mouse over here, we can see we've got 128, 12, or 171, 227. The luminosity, so effectively the grayscale version of it is 164. And what that's referring to is if I took all of these values here, merge them together and switch to a luma curve, or a luma version of the histogram, that's what it looks like. And that's the readout that you're getting at that point. So it's telling you a form of brightness. So luminosity, read into that effectively brightness from 0 to 255 without any color sway or influence or whatever that you get with that. Okay, so let's go back to our mountain. So we've got our global change there, and it's already feeling a bit warmer. What I want to do then is pull up some of this stuff down the bottom. Now the temptation and the default, I guess, for us now, because we're all used to it, is let's use a filled layer and turn our mask on, go to a luma range, and we say, well, we only want to adjust the dark parts of the mountain. Yeah, that looks pretty good. Let's put a bit of a softening into that as well. And then with that, we could effectively pull up our exposure. but I don't like the effect that's going to give us, because the effect feels unnatural. And by unnatural, I mean it couldn't have been created in the camera. There's no filter that you have in the camera that can draw a nice jagged edge that perfectly matches that mountain. So it doesn't really make sense that it's done that. I would personally prefer something a little bit more subtle. So the way that I'm going to do it, I'm going to create a brand new layer, an empty layer, with a gradient mask. So we've got obviously two ways of dealing with gradients. One is in the field, you typically cut light with a graduated filter. So you have the darker part of the filter on the top, lighter part on the bottom, and you let more light into the bottom than you do the top. I don't know whether Brian used a grad filter on this, but let's assume not, because we've got this massive variation between these two. But instead I can do it in software. So I'm just going to draw a graduated filter that comes from down here to up here, because I want whatever I do to fall off naturally as it gets near the top. So even though I'm going to focus purely on the shadows and the black in terms of the sliders, I don't want to have as much of an effect up here with that as I do down here, because I want this to fall off and look natural at the top of the mountain. I don't want this to start looking cartoony by overdoing it, and then all of a sudden the background sky is a problem. Okay, so so Pablo was saying I was thinking only in global blacks. You know, you can, of course you can. So let's do that globally. Let's just go to a completely filled layer. I'm just going to call this grad bottom. So here's my filled layer. Now if I pull up shadows, for example, and pull up black, well, black is going to affect this darker part of the image anyway, so let's just temporarily undo that. So we can see down here, this is dark. This is fully in the black section of the slider. As I move my mouse around, you get the orange bar on the histogram that's telling us, look at where it's at. It's in that bottom sort of 5%. This is going to be affected by the black slider. Up here, a bit lighter, it's more in the shadows slider. So as I affect the shadows and bring them up, it's going to affect the mountain more. As I pull up the blacks, it's going to affect down here more. But you see how false this looks. It just doesn't look real, and it's because we've flattened and crushed all of those shadows, all the contrast in this image, and then it just stops. All of that crushing just stops the second we get beyond the shadows and into the sky. So we've got a hyper realistic sky because it's real, and a hyper unrealistic set of shadows. And I don't like that. So instead, what I would do is, yes, that same method. But instead of doing it all the way up into all the shadows, we actually have it fall off as we get nearer towards the sky, so we don't notice the blend as much. So if I pull up the shadows just a little bit, again, be really careful with this, and the blacks just a little bit, in fact that's too much there, even to there, that's enough. Now with this base, and going back to, I can't remember who asked about it, but with this base we can play with our white balance a bit more. So if I want to warm the mountain down here, we can. If I want to cool the mountain, I can, but of course it's going to fall off as it gets nearer to the top of that mountain peak. So I'm actually going to warm it up a little bit and put a little bit more of a tint on there. So that to me, and let's actually be fair, so let's do a 20 and a 4 on the other adjustment layer. So if I set this one to 20 and that to 4, if I look at the differences between this one and this one just seems to fall off more naturally as you get nearer and nearer the top of the mountain, and then I don't notice that difference into the sky. This one just has a sort of flattening effect over the mountain, and it's subtle, don't get me wrong, but it does make a difference when you're looking at it on a wall. Okay, so let's just get rid of that one. So that's our graduated bottom filter. So on there we've got our white balance has been slightly warmed. We've got a slight shift of tint up to about up to a couple of points more. The shadows have been lifted, the blacks have been lifted, and what we're also going to do is add a touch of clarity. Now, because it's all sat in the shadows down at the bottom, we can be a little bit aggressive with this. We can put some structure on too. But let's just have a look at without and with. So that's without, and that's with. And again, without and with. And again, just with clarity, I want that clarity to fall off before it gets up here. The reason being because I don't want to see halos over the top of my mountain where there's that big discrepancy or disparity between the dark mountain and the bright sky. So let's, yeah, so Earl's just said he spotted this thing. Oh, I think he spotted this thing, or are you talking about another one? Another sunspot? No, I think we're talking about this one on the right-hand side. But anyway, yeah, I like this one. Little sun coming through, little peak. And that's one of the other reasons why I've kept this whole piece in there. Okay, so That's then lifted everything. We've got a lot more texture and detail in that bottom part of the mountain, and then we can play with the sky a little bit differently. So let's add a new empty layer, and we're going to call this one sky. With our sky, again, to make sure that it feels natural and falls off, we're not going to paint a perfect mask around the sky. We're going to do this. So we've got literally that top part of the sky built in, and it drops off as we get further down. Now with this part of the sky, what I'm going to do is go to our color editor, and we're going to do something a little bit weird. We're going to go to our skin tone. So skin tone was designed to even up the color in someone's skin, hence the name. But we can also use it on the sky. We've done it a few times before. We're just going to do it again on here. So I'm choosing this area of color. So anything that sits inside this arc. And I started by picking somewhere on the sky with that little picker tool. And then I've got two sets of sliders. The first slider says what to do with that color. The second slider says how uniform all of the colors in that arc need to behave. So let's have a little play. So if I increase the saturation on the blue and decrease our lightness, in fact we could even play with the hue, so we can make it a little greener. It's very subtle, a little bit pinker. Let's just leave that where it was, but we are going to ramp up the saturation. And I'm now going to make the sky more uniform in saturation, in lightness. So look at this difference here. Unfortunately, it's clipping the mountain as well. We might have to remove that in a second. But what it's doing, let me just temporarily undo this so you can see. So there's without, there's with. So forget this mountings, we're going to remove that in a second. But without and with. And what we've done is we've made the whole sky just lift a little bit, but not just one color within the sky. Effectively, this entire arc of color. So anything that falls within this arc, we've then said to it, boost the saturation by quite a way, actually, 22. Pull down the lightness, so let's pull down a little bit of the luminosity in it. In fact, we're going to push that a bit more. But any color within this mask here, based on where this original dot was placed, needs to be really uniform. It needs to be very similar to its neighbors. So the hue needs to be almost the same. Saturation needs to be equivalent across the entire range of color, and the lightness needs to be mostly the same as well. So that just has a way of smoothing out any discrepancies in color, saturation, any of that stuff in the sky. Now I mentioned we've got a bit of an issue where that's actually affecting the mountain. Why? Well, because some of this stuff was blue, we knew that. So I'm going to right click on here and say rasterize mask. So that makes it no longer editable as a gradient. We literally have a mask there. And then in here, I'm going to choose my eraser brush. And we're going to make sure we're up at 100% because I want none of it, but a really, really soft edge. And I'm just going to erase out the mountain from that color mask. There. So now we don't have the mountain affected by it. So if I do my temporary undo and redo, we can see it's affecting the sky, but not the mountain. Cool. Is there, maybe there's a bit of a temptation. I could put in a bit of a exposure drop on it. So let's just pull that down a bit. Makes it a bit moodier for sure. And we could pull in our highlights just a touch, but I'm really conscious of not making this whole image look too dark. So what I might do then over the top of this is do a filled adjustment layer. And with my filled layer, if I want to, I can play with levels just to tweak the image a little bit brighter. If I really wanted to. And that'd be it, pretty much. Mobius, the arc sliders next to the color wheel. So we covered that on Monday's session. So I went into it on in more detail on Monday. But just as a quick example here, so just so you can see, so these arc sliders effectively, the further you get out from the middle, the more saturation, so 0 saturation through to 100% saturation of this color. And then the sliders, these arc things, tell it how much latitude or how much margin it's got to play left and right of this hue. So the hue is the position in the middle. Left and right is the extent of the other colors that we want to include in that arc. And the further you come out, this is fully saturated through to no saturation in the middle. Okay, Steve, why did I not use the advanced color wheel, which is the one we're on at the moment? Because the advanced color wheel gives me a lot more room to do more saturation shift and more hue shift. but it doesn't have that extra set of sliders about uniformity. We'll cover it in the another one I know we've got an image of later, but effectively that gives us, so yeah, that's the question. So the skin tone version is effectively the advanced color wheel, but with a reduction in the amount of change you can make to things like saturation, but with the added benefit that we can tell all of the colors that are in that arc to behave more uniformly than you can on the advanced one. So if you look on the advanced one, we don't have that option to do it. And that's why, to me, the skin tone thing's a bit of it's named wrong. It was designed originally so that if you have blemishes on skin or variations in tone on skin, you could choose a skin tone and effectively, for want of a better phrase, flatten out the tones on the skin and make them more uniform. But it also works on sky, it also works on water, it also works on green grass and all the other stuff. Okay, let's just have one final little before after on here. So again, all of these things were really small changes. But do you now see what I mean by this mountain started off looking quite green? So when you first look at it, it's like, okay, that's fine. When you start tweaking it and you see how green this is to what would be almost, and remember as well, we didn't actually push it all the way up to be completely white. If we look at our RGB values at the top, it's still shifted towards blue. It's 122 blue versus 106, 104 for red and green. So be careful with the fact that your eyes will adjust and see snow as white when actually maybe it wasn't. Maybe it wasn't quite there. Okay, so a couple of questions. Is it possible to create a linear gradient mask that only covers part of a frame, i.e. it covers the middle third vertically? Not quite sure what you mean, Nick. So in terms of a linear gradient mask, it will always go from 100% to 0%. You can change the fall off of that, but what you'd have to do effectively, so if you wanted it to stop for whatever reason, I'm not sure why, but let's create a new layer so you can see. So just do a test gradient, and I'll just show you. This is going to ruin the image, so don't judge the image, but let's just turn our mask on. So if I did a gradient like that, this is always going to be 100, this is always going to be 0, and so on. What I'd have to do if I wanted to stop it there would be rasterize that mask, get my eraser, and effectively either do it through lines, but you know, I could do that. Let's just turn off my before and after to there, to there. I'm just holding down the shift key in between each dot, and then I could, it's a bit messy to do because I can't fill this erase hole. I could do it that way if that's what you mean, but I may have misunderstood what you meant. So yeah, I'm not sure exactly why, but if that's not what you meant, let me know, Nick, in the comments. But if it is what you meant, then yes, it's possible to do it, but I'm not sure what effect you're going to get with that mask, because if I do anything with it, it's just going to look really weird as a fall off. But yeah, okay. So one other question, where were we? Can you show us Lightroom defectors how you dehaze in Capture One since there is no dehaze slider? This is a very current conversation. So dehaze, I'll put my position very clearly. I don't believe there can be one dehaze slider, and that goes for Lightroom as well as other products. The reason is, and this is where it's a little frustrating, because people seem to want a quick fix for everything. Haze doesn't come in one form. So the haze that comes from streetlights at night is different to the haze that comes from the sun in the morning, or the fog in San Francisco, or the pollution over Shanghai. All of those different versions of haze have completely different properties and completely different ways of removing them. So if someone says to me there's one slider that does all of this with no intervention from the user whatsoever, I just don't believe it. And so far, in every one that I've tested, I can do it better manually and would continue to do so. So I think there's a place for those sliders, and I think as a quick starter for 10, it's a good way of seeing how clear we can get the image. But typically you're talking about changing the curve, you're talking about changing the clarity within an image. And if you go onto our YouTube, there's a section on YouTube called Pro Tips, and in there is a dehaze video. It's about 20 minutes long, and it covers exactly how to do it better, in my view, than a Lightroom slider. So have a look, have a play. But the one thing I would say is it depends on the haze. So what you'll do is over time you'll learn that certain haze needs a different approach to others to get the clearest results. Okay, so let's go on to our next shot, which was Jerry's. So Jerry asked me to have a look at this shot, and I'm sort of struggling a little bit because I'm not sure what our subject is on this shot. And we've got these cars in the background here, which are a bit distracting. We're not quite level, so it looks like it was taken slightly off. So we're going to do a bit of keystoning for sure. And I might have to do an extreme crop to make this really stand out. So let's just run through it very quickly. Here's our horizontal keystone tool. So up here, the default is going to be vertical when you choose keystone from Capture One. You can choose four-way keystone or horizontal. In this case, I'm not worried about the vertical lines, it's the horizontal lines. We've got this leaning in here and this pavement going away here. So we're going to use these lines, and I'm just drawing or moving the dots so that this line matches that pavement, and I'm going to move this dot so that it matches that roof. Now, try and do this as far away from the center as possible, because it means that small variations, when you might get it slightly wrong, don't have quite such a big impact due to the angle. Let's hit apply. Okay, that's done a good job. We've now got our level roof, so this looks a bit more purposed. And I'm going to leave with our original crop in place, and we're going to do quite a heavy crop on this shot, I think. So I'm going to lose this gap here. We can't lose all the gaps, we just lose all the photo if we do. But what we can do is come into sort of there. That sort of works. Okay. So this feels like a better shot. I'm still not entirely sure what we're trying to draw the viewer's attention to, but what we can do is obviously recover some of these highlights here and sort out down here. So I'm actually going to do this on the background there because it's pretty global that we're doing this. So number one, let's pull our highlights in and whites in as well. So if I go to before and after, so we can see that's before, that's after. So the camera captured all of this extra texture in here, but obviously with the light it was blown out. Well, we can recover that back within reason using these two sliders. We can pull up shadow again, but that's going to flatten everything. So remember with shadow, and we talk about it quite a bit, shadow and black recovery have the effect of flattening an image because what's happening is you're crushing all that contrast into the middle of the shot. So you really should decide which one is the driver in the correction. So are you trying to pull up things that are in the bottom 5% of the histogram? If so, use the black slider. If it's all of the shadows, the bottom 25% of the histogram, use the shadow slider. But try not to use both of them together, because if you do, you're sort of cartooning on top of cartoon. It doesn't really work. So in this case, a little bit of shadow recovery, a little bit more black, that works. And we can pull a bit of clarity up and some structure to get some of this stuff here where the edges and textures have some detail in. And then that's sort of where we can get to. So I'm sort of in a place of, it's improved over the original. We've got more color in there. We've got the highlights back. We've got everything recovered. It's certainly a very different crop to what we had. So if I create a new variant and show the, clone variant, and let's just reset. There we go. So there's our original, there's our final, but I'm not sure what we're trying to lead the viewer to see, and that's a bit of a struggle for me on that shot. Okay, Barry sent in this shot, and actually what's really useful with some of the shots that you guys send in, you've started including the EIP. So that file I was talking about earlier, the Capture One portable version of the file, is really, really useful because I can see not just the raw, but I can also see the edits that people have made, and we can see the layers and everything like that. So going back to, I think, was it Nick's question? I can't remember. Sorry, but whoever it was that asked it earlier, going back to that question about, can I flatten the Capture One file? I wouldn't. I would keep, if anything, what I would do when you're finished and you're happy with the final image, export the EIP. So that's, right click, go to export, but you go to originals rather than variants. And that includes so effectively the raw file plus all these layers and adjustments. And then export a flattened TIFF. Make sure it's 16-bit if you can, to keep all the color range in there. But effectively, those are your two outputs from Capture One. So the EIP in this case, I can see what Barry's added in, and I can see our original image. And I'm going to say that the edited one has one problem, well, two issues that I can see with it that make it a bit uncomfortable in my eye. Number one, we've got a bit of a saturation boost going on. It's shifted it to be more blue. Let me just go and compare here. So that blue has become really saturated, which can happen. You can have days like this. I've seen them, but from the original, there's quite a big variant. But more concerning to me, and I'm just going to go on to our before and after. Look at all the detail that we've lost. So let me just zoom into here so we can really see. So here's all this detail with all of this foliage and the hoarfrost. I think it's hoarfrost, someone said, that's landed on all of that vegetation. So you've got all of those little ice crystals and everything like that, and all the texture in the snow here. But then this has been so punched in contrast that we lose all that detail. And to me, that's a bit of a shame to lose. So while I get that this gives it a bit more punch, I wouldn't have done it to that extent, because it just feels like you're punching too much to the point where, and if I, for instance, if I look, for some reason my interesting, one of my keyboard shortcuts has reset to what I didn't want. So as I move my mouse over here, we can see, these are really, really close to that edge. They're almost in the clipping point. Whereas down here they weren't. They were in the upper highlights. They weren't quite that punchy as highlights. So we've got two options. One is I can start from here, but two, we're probably going to do it from Barry's adjustments, and we're just going to tone some of them down a little bit. So if I turn this layer off and on, we can see that contrast adjustment is the biggest thing that's an issue here with this layer. Because if I turn this layer off, everything starts to sort of calm down a little bit. Everything starts to feel a bit more comfortable again. And all it is this curve. So this is a standard S curve to a certain extent. It's less curved here. But what's happened is we've punched all of these highlights here. So the stuff that's in the top 1/3 of the image. And you can see on this curve, what Barry's done is pulled it up. So we get that big contrast. But that big contrast comes at a price, which is we've lost some of the detail and the texture down here. So again, let's just turn it off and on and off and on. It's just too much. So we could calm down the curve, but actually what I found is the only thing this layer is doing is that curve. So I'm going to turn it off. I don't think we need it. Because the other thing as well with this curve is this bottom part here, you can see, was affecting this lake down here. I think we can do this another way. So I'm going to delete that layer, and that's why. We've got our global adjustment, which strangely actually calms things down. So as you see, when I turn this on, we get more detail back, which tells me something's gone on somewhere in either the background or it's not in our curve. Maybe it's in our RGB. No. So there's something a bit weird. What's gone on here? This is a bit of a mystery, isn't it? So there's our original. There we are there. Is it perhaps with our film standard? No, because if we go into there, this is going to be set to auto. Okay. Let's try setting this into auto. So for some reason, this raw, and I can't quite work out immediately what it is that's done it, but for some reason, this raw, even the background with no adjustments made to it, has had some weird contrast addition. So if anyone can see it, because I can't, let me know. But otherwise, we're going to start from here, I think, because this global adjustment here has brought everything back. So it's brought some clarity back. It's brought up our highlights and stuff like that. But the background without it doesn't have that, which is a bit strange. So let's do what we should have done. Let's start from here. With this, actually, I like the crop that Barry chose. I don't know whether it was a 2x1, but let's assume it was. So we're going to come up to roughly the same sort of position. In fact, it must have been maybe a 3x2, but let's come into there, I think. We can go to there. Okay. So that feels like a nice crop. It's good. It's very similar to what we had in Barry's crop as well. But with this, we're just going to make sure that we're protecting all those details. So let's go into here. And let's think about what we want to do to protect those. So number one, we can pull down the whites a little bit and pull down our highlights. The reason I'm doing this is similar to what I did last week on the one with the rocks that I showed you from a helicopter, which is almost putting a bit of a fire blanket over those highlights, because what I'm then going to do is use levels to try and punch the image a little bit. So remember, contrast and levels effectively take that histogram and they pull things. So contrast literally goes to the middle and it says, right, everything brighter than 128, make brighter again. Everything darker, make darker again. And that's how it does contrast. Levels, we can do it a little bit more granularly, but also we've got a curve that we can play with as well. So in this case, as I pull down our highlight level, that's going to make everything get brighter. So our input versus output. When I do that, the stuff that's already near to 255 up here, so if I just go up to here, we're at 249, 248, 246, that could clip. So if I were to undo this, let's go up here, we're a little bit higher again, so we're at 251, 250, 247. So effectively, by pulling down these highlights and the whites, so protecting them, that gives me a little more latitude to be able to pull in the overall levels and the overall shadows, if I need to protect any shadows as well, of the image. And that just gives us an image that just pops a little bit more. But do you see we haven't lost any detail? In fact, we've gained some. So if I go back into this snow area here, there's our original, there's our version with those adjustments. So the image now, there's our original again, there's the version. So the image now pops, but it's popping in a way that hasn't pushed any highlights off the end. They're not overexposed. It hasn't pushed any shadows off the end, so they're not underexposed, by using some of the HDR tool against this level adjustment. And it just gives me a bit more latitude to be able to pull even more of this up a little bit brighter. Some of you on the Facebook group were asking about the middle slider. So effectively, it's the same as the top and bottom. I was thinking Photoshop, we used to use, it was gamma, you could put in a 0 point whatever adjustment. But if you don't touch the middle slider, it will move proportionately to the change here and the change there. And then you can adjust it and fine tune it a little bit if you want. And in this case, I'm actually going to make it so that our image ends up with a slight bias towards the darks. So we've got an overall lift, an overall punch, and an overall increase in contrast, but we're pushing most of the tones back down a little bit. So we've got our highlight points as the contrast points and everything else with all of its full detail, which looks fantastic. On top of that, I can push up brightness a little bit. I can afford to do that because, again, I've protected some of those highlights with our HDR tool. And then on top of that, and you notice I'm doing all of this on background, which is not normal, but that's where we're at. So with our clarity tool, we can pull up a little bit. So let's just do a before and after. So that's without clarity change. That's with the clarity change. Very, very minor. In fact, almost imperceivable to a certain extent. But our structure change, let me do it to 100% so you can see. Structure will pull up all of this detail in that frost, but too much if you overdo it. So let's go into here. So without that, let's go without. It now looks a bit blurry, if anything, with over sharp. So structure and clarity, and we say this quite a lot, use them sparingly. So try and use as little as you need to have an impact, but no more. So there, with our before and after, let's have a look at the difference. So you see how everything's just got a bit crisper. And when we're talking about frost and frozen stuff and ice and snow, it's really nice if you can get it to a place where it's nice and tight and sharp and crisp, but not so you're causing the viewer's eyes to bleed. Do not do it too much. We could, I can't remember who asked it, it may have been Jed, I think, on Facebook the last couple of days, was asking about why not use the sharpening tool. We can do it with the sharpening tool, but in this case, it's the texture I want to bring out, and structure does that out of the box pretty well anyway. We could do it with sharpening, but I'm not worried about edges and lines. They're all sharp anyway. It's the texture I'm trying to get at, and that's what structure does really well. And then we can look at that difference up there. If we want to increase our blues, for example, well, let's go to our color editor. Oops, wrong one. And I'm going to choose the advanced one. So rather than making it uniform, it doesn't make sense to make this uniform because there is difference in the sky. We've got the cloud going through it. So in this case, I'm just going to stretch that out there. And with this, I can punch that hue a little bit. Now, bit of a tip. If I pull the saturation. If I pull the saturation up, you see how that goes all rather quite putrid. Pull the lightness down to keep it natural. So saturation, you really don't want to be pushing too much. But if you do push it, try and pull lightness down as well, which keeps it more natural. And what you're going to see is I'm doing this to a much smaller extent than I started. But it does have an impact. So if I temporarily undo, that's without, and that's with the change, we can see that it has had a change. Now, if I go onto this one here, which is the arc that I created, let's just put our saturation up too much. Don't worry, we're going to fix that. Now with hue, I can change the feel of this to be more towards the pink side. So if we look at this wheel, so we can shift the hue around to the pink, or if I shift it the other way, it goes more to the green side. So in this case, I'm going to shift it slightly, just slightly, towards the pink side. I'm going to pull that saturation right down again, so that we're not overdoing it for sure. And that just then gets rid of any of that, again, sort of green tint that we've got going on in certain spots. Now, if I just move my mouse over the snow, I just want to do that one check that we did earlier. So look at those numbers at the top, 255, 255, 25, or sorry, 225, 225, 223. That's telling me that's pretty much neutral white, which is great news. We don't have to do much in the way of white balance change. If we did want to, well, we can do that manually, and all I'd be tempted to do is just to knock out a bit more green, and we get to there. Now, one final thing I might, and this is down to personal choice, I might put a very, very soft gradient mask on there and just knock that exposure down a little bit. We do have our lens profile loaded in. It doesn't have a distortion correction need on it. There might be some diffraction, but to be honest, I'm not seeing much of it out here, and actually our structure has fixed that right up anyway. And there we go. So we go from there, flat, to here, a lot more crisp. But what we don't have, and actually we ended up, I actually removed, unfortunately, the version that Barry sent in, but I think it was this, yeah. So in this version here, just do that so we can focus on them on their own. So in the version that was sent in with the adjustments, it's just too powerful, it's just too strong, it's too much contrast in it for my eye. I want it to feel more natural, and that's where we get to with this. If I create another version of this, but the original, so we go from original here to the edit that I've just done, and now you'll see when I go to this version, it's just a bit too much. It just hurts a bit. To me, that's a wonderful photo. It's a really nice photo. It's really well captured. And they're just small changes we're making to really emphasize things. I could, if I wanted to, we could spend a little bit of time up here on the trees. So if I do up here a little bit of a mask, we may as well leave it at 100 for the sake of this. And just in those trees, we could pop in just a touch more clarity. So we could make them pop a little bit more. That's a nice addition. But you don't have to do that. The key is to keep it looking natural. And for me, that to there is a nice way of enhancing it. Here we just go a little bit over. So yeah, that'll be where we go. Okay. So that's that one, and then we have Gundula. If I said your name wrong, I apologise, but we'll go with that one for now. This is a shot from Namibia, I think. Really, really nice scene. We're just going to add a little bit of drama to it, basically. So we've got a manufacturer profile loaded in. Remember, so the order, I guess, of hierarchy. Effectively, we've got the correct lens loaded in automatically. Wonderful. Use that lens profile and edit from there. If not, and you've got a manufacturer profile flagged in there, it means that the camera has embedded the profile for that lens and camera into the file. Wonderful. Use that as well. Then if you don't have either of those, use the generic one and make any adjustments from there. What I wouldn't recommend unless you've tested it is choosing another random lens that seems very similar to yours, because each lens, even the difference between a 2.8 version of a lens and an f4 version of a lens, can be dramatic in terms of the result that you get when you do any distortion correction. So your exact lens, ideal. Manufacturer profile, great if your exact lens isn't loaded in. Generic, and then worst case scenario, but it's, you can play with it, you can have a try, but load in a similar lens, but I'd stick to generic personally. So in this case, we've got the manufacturer profile loaded in. I'm going to go to chromatic aberration. Because it doesn't know this lens, it's automatically done our analyze, which we'd normally do manually anyway. I'm not worried about diffraction. I think we're pretty good out here. Yeah, we're nice and sharp. That's good. There's no real sharpness fall off to worry about anyway. So with that, we're going to go straight to our exposure tab, which is where we spend most of our time. We have got a little bit of light fall off, which I can't, of course, edit on this version. So around here with the vignette. So I'm actually going to use it's a DNG. That's not helpful for us either. But with our vignetting, we can actually brighten those edges just to flatten out the image. Do you see the difference? So if I go to before and after, we can see this has quite a heavy vignette, whereas here we've flattened out those edges and they've all become the same brightness. So let's go on to our color editor again. I said we'd come back to this skin tone, so about trying to make all of this sky uniform. So let's go on to a new filled layer, because we want to fill everything and adjust everything. With our skin tone tool, go to the picker, choose somewhere in the middle of all these tones. We're going to expand this arc. Now, if I had other blue stuff down here, we'd want to remove it so that we don't affect it with the color editor, but actually we don't. The only area blue up is up here, so I'm not too worried if the mask goes over other areas. If I was worried, of course, I could go to the erase tool, just do it, and remove all of this other stuff so that we know if we are doing any color changes, we're not affecting anything else in the image, but actually it's going to be safe in this case anyway. So what I'm saying is this whole arc here is what I want to affect. And with it, I'm going to boost the saturation a touch. I'm going to pull down its lightness a touch. But most importantly, for anything in this arc, I want it to behave uniform. I want it to feel effectively flatter as the sky. And the reason is because I want to draw the attention to the ground for all the texture. So if I turn this off, you can see there's variation in the sky. Turn it on, and we've flattened everything. It's become the same hue, the same saturation, the same lightness, roughly. I'm going to pull this saturation down a bit because I think it was a bit too much as it was there. But do you see the difference? If I do a before and after here, there to there, completely personal choice. If you prefer not to do it, then don't. It's just, to me, I want to bring all the focus down here into this texture in the bottom. So with that done, let's go back to our exposure tab. Now we can have a bit of fun, because I want to make this feel a bit more like a sunset and a bit more dramatic, a bit more vivid. So whereas in the previous shot with Barry, we had a lot of stuff that was out here on the edges of the histogram. Let's just go back to that shot, in fact, so you can see. So on our histogram, we've got stuff up here in the highlights and stuff down here in the shadows that I can hurt if I push the contrast too far. Whereas on here, in Gundula's image, we've got a huge amount of room up here where there's no data. There's no data in the highlights. There's no real data in the shadows either. So with our levels tool down here, and again, we can do it on a separate layer if we want to. So let's go to a filled layer and we call it levels. I'm just going to rename this one to be sky so we don't get confused. So with our levels layer, which has everything on there, to see your mask, press M on the keyboard, remember, and press M to get rid of it. But with our levels tool set on one particular layer, I'm just going to pull this down here and pull our shadows up. Now remember what the levels tool is actually doing. It's stretching the histogram, and you can see it do it up there live. So if I undo and redo. So what it's doing is it's mapping that histogram, and it's saying, right, if you were 210 before, you're now 255. And obviously if you were 209, then you might be 254 point something or whatever, and so on. If you were 6 before, so not quite black, now push yourself to be 0, so literally black on the black to white scale. And those stretches allow us to add contrast, and it's a version of what the contrast tool does, but the contrast tool up here is a very, very dumb, blunt instrument. What the contrast tool does is it takes pretty much the midpoint of 128 and it says, right, anything brighter, make yourself brighter again, anything darker, make yourself darker again. You'll see in here that I've made the highlights, or the lighter parts of the image, have a much more dramatic map, a much more dramatic change than down in the shadows. And the shadows have only moved 6 out of 255, so anything that was 6 is now 0. In the highlights, in the whites, this is 210 up to 255. It's a huge shift. Now in the contrast tool, it would have done them evenly from that midpoint, and that's why we don't tend to use the contrast tool unless you have a histogram, which is smack bang in the middle, and that's what you were going to do with levels anyway. But what we've already got now with this change is something that's just a bit more stark, a bit more high contrast. And then I'm going to do something weird, which is, unlike normally we'd always try and make sure it was mapping exactly what was there, I'm going to artificially change our white balance here. And I want it to have a bit more of a reddy tone about it. Where are we? Would the image, oh, from Steve, sorry. Would the image strengthen when cropping a bit, cut apart from the left over here? Potentially. Depends whether you like that negative space or not. One thing I have noticed, however, and I think it's come from my color editor overzealousness, is we've got this stuff. Oh no, it's just on the preview, thankfully. Okay. I was worried then, so in the preview we've got these weird dots there that were appearing. One point actually, I can't remember who was asking. Someone was asking on Facebook the other day about single pixels. So when you see a hot pixel on the camera, and the fact that when you fix them at 100%, it still shows as broken when you went into the full view, so fit on the screen. With Capture One, there is a slight discrepancy between your preview that's been generated and looking at the image at 100, 200, 300, even 67%. So at 100%, this looks fine. Back out at the preview, in order to do that previewing, it's got a little bit dotty out here, which doesn't really make sense. Always rely on it being 100%. If it's corrected 100%, that's what you're going to get. The preview is literally that. It's a preview. It can be a bit annoying because you think that something's gone wrong, or you think that something's not quite right, and you need to fix it when actually you zoom into 100% and you don't. But that's a bit of a challenge. So as Andy's just said, I have to say congratulations for the last two images. A great couple of shots. Yeah, they are. And genuinely, this one here, I love this shot. I'm not exactly sure where it was. Pitpolder, I'm not sure, but it's a stunning location. It's really, really nice. So yeah, cool. On this one, so we've altered the white balance. We've effectively reddened it a little bit, and we've warmed it up a little bit. Not too much. And again, it's all about doing that in variation. Oops, sorry, I've done that on the sky. Didn't mean to do that. Let's go back onto our... where was I? Oh yeah, on our background. So with our background layer, I'm just going to make sure we've got that arid, stark, sort of deserty look in there. Then we've got debate as to whether or not you want to do that with the sky. So we might, as a result of shifting the white balance, now go back to our color editor, advantage of it being on a layer, and say, actually, we don't want to saturate it quite that much. And let's just make sure this is looking good. And again, look at that difference out here. When I go into 100%, we get this lovely fall off in the cloud. When I come out, we get this horrible preview. So always rely on the 100% view, not the zoomed out one. Where are we? I also just said I want to get rid of the twig that goes into the sky in the middle. This one, if we mean that one, okay. Healing brush will do it, but I may struggle with that. So let's have a look. Oh, Barry's just answered. Where you live? Fraser Valley of BC. Nice. Might have to add that to a list. But look, we're all coming to Barry's house. So let's just have a little play with this again a bit more. So number one, I want to add some drama into this shot. So we said that we could do that effectively through changing some of the white balance, some of the level stuff, but now I want to do some specifics in the area. So let's add in some shadow. So with our shadow, I'm just going to literally pick on a rough brush. Doesn't really matter. I can go to this low opacity. And as I paint in with opacity, every time I let go of the mouse and paint in another go, what we're going to get is an add to that layer. So each layer is, or each click is almost 20%. Some of you will remember from one a long time ago, there's some complicated maths in how it does it, because it's an inverse equation, but there's our mask. And with our mask, what I can now do is pull down exposure there. Now we get some nice long shadows as an effect. With our background, I can pull up the overall brightness in the image. That's looking pretty nice. And actually, with the background, we can afford to add in a punch of clarity, a bit of structure. It's looking pretty good. I might want to pull in, let's just do a grad left. I'm going to put in a very subtle graduated filter into the left with a small exposure drop, just so that we're picking up these lumps here. And again, just do another similar one, grad right. And it's a really subtle amount, but I just want to pull not even that much down to there maybe. I'm going to stretch this so it's really soft, just like that. And that's kind of where I'd get to. So if we ignore the preview issue, we go from here. Lovely plate, lovely location, lovely shot. It's captured really well. We haven't lost any data, and that means that we can play with this a lot more. And that's really the key. As long as you've got all the data that you want in your histogram, you can play with these things to your heart's content. But to me, that's just added an extra bit of drama. So what we've done is we've uniformed the sky a little bit. So we've settled it a little bit more than it was. We've added in some extra drama and contrast with our levels tool. We've pulled down this area here selectively. So our mask here, let's just switch to a grayscale mask so you can see there we're actually pulling up these lumps separately. And that gives us a bit more drama, a bit more shadow work going on. And we've added in a little bit of fall off here on the left and right, just to make sure that we're pulling all of our focus onto these items here, which gives us a big difference in terms of the amount of drama from there to there. Don't worry about this stuff out here on the horizon. When we zoom in, that's all gone. It's just a weird preview thing, but there we go. So that's it for today, everyone. Earl, I didn't get to delete the weird stick. I don't know what stick you mean. We'll play with it separately. Maybe later on I'll have to come back to it. But yeah, there we go. So we go from a really cool shot of the mountains. It's just been brought basically a bit more natural, a bit more neutral. We could get rid of that moon if we wanted to with the healing tool. Personally, I'd be tempted to leave it in, but if you really wanted to, well, let's just pull that down there and go click, moon gone. Okay, but I wouldn't, I'd leave it in. Really nice shot of the mountain. We've got Jerry's shot of, it's not a cathedral, isn't it? It's Santa Fe, I think you said, Jerry, something like that. Again, a crop helps this image. It gets rid of the distractions of the cars and everything on here. And look at the detail that you brought back in the highlights there, just from using that one highlight slider in HDR. Barry's shot of the frost out in British Columbia is a stunning location. Really want to go there when I can. But again, keep it natural and protect those highlights. Don't lose detail where you don't need to. And then finally, this one where we've just taken it from there. Really nice soft light, but we've just added in that punch of drama that sort of makes it stand out a bit more. Okay, so in the meantime, we will, if Earl, if you want to have the conversation about the twig that I can't find, then go onto the Facebook group. We'll try and pick up where we left off. For things like how to use the clarity tool, how to use the sharpening tool, how to dehaze, there's a whole thing on dehaze on these YouTube channel pro tips things. So it's on the channel you're already on, but they're sort of 15 to 20 minute bite-sized things on a particular subject. Just have a little play with those and that'll help you quite a lot. Send in your images as raw files, please. We will pick up again next Thursday, so same time as normal, so 3 p.m. in the UK next Thursday. Some of you I know are changing your clocks this weekend, so that may mess things up a little bit, but we'll try and get the times published correctly for you all. And in the meantime, if anyone needs to get hold of us, that's how to do it. And we will see you in 7 days' time. Cheers, everyone. Bye.